Good afternoon. Welcome to this Christmas installment of Poetry Thursdays. I have picked out a Christmas-themed poem this week by Mary Ruefle or Ruefle. I'm sorry to Mary. I don't know how to pronounce your last name. I wasn't sure if the E made it Ruefle or Ruffle or if it was like Ruefle. I'm so sorry. But the poem is called Recollections of My Christmas Tree. And I, of course, will link it down below if you would like to see more from Mary and her poetry collections. Recollections of My Christmas Tree. I have always been vulnerable when confronted with Christmas decorations, and I am sitting in my living room staring at them. The lights on the tree are blinking on and off, and I'm mesmerized. I have never been to a hypnotist, but maybe mesmerization is the last state you enter before going over the edge into hypnosis. Maybe being mesmerized is the last thing you remember. It does seem to be a state all its own. When I was a child, I did the same thing. Watched the lights blink on and off, alone in the living room at night. The only difference is I know a lot more about Christmas now than I did then. I knew practically nothing then. My mother put an electric candle in each window. They were ivory-colored plastic, and at the end of each taper, near the bulb, fake drips of wax were molded. I loved the drips the most. It meant that the candles looked real to people inside the house, not just to people looking at them from the outside. What I didn't know then was that these decorations evolved from the Jewish menorah, the Hebrew festival of lights. I didn't think my mother knew that either, but if she did, she never mentioned it. And I certainly never contemplated the resemblance of a sleigh to a cradle. A sleigh is basically a very large cradle. The runners of the sleigh are what makes the cradle rock. Once there was a very eccentric man in the 19th century in upstate New York. And when he was in his 50s, he had a carpenter build him a cradle. I saw it in a museum, the biggest cradle ever made, and every night he slept in it. And when he entered his last illness, he stayed in the cradle day and night, feeling the sensual throes of the cradle while somebody nursed and rocked him. I mean, in the sense of caring for him. He died in his cradle, and the card on the wall of the museum said he was happy at the end. When I was a child, one of my ornaments was a little red velveteen sleigh. I used to put a tiny doll in it, but now it is empty. I don't even like it anymore, and when I was decorating the tree, I thought about throwing it away. But then I remembered the man in the cradle and decided to keep it. My mother and father also decorated the outside of our house with lights. We lived in a different house every year, so it wasn't easy. The length of the light strings kept changing. People who live in the same house every year don't think about things like that. Their dimensions stay the same. There's no need to adjust anything, ever. After the lights were up on the outside of the house, my father would put us in the car and drive around the neighborhood, looking at the lights on the other houses. Sometimes he made disparaging remarks and sometimes in silence admired them. When he admired them, he would make changes in his own lights the following year. But as we were by then in a new house, none of the neighbors knew we were copycats. The most beautiful yard we ever saw had a snow scene with a frozen pond in the middle and life-sized figure skaters who floated across the pond wearing muffs. This was in Southern California, so everything was fake. The snow, the frozen pond, even the skaters were fake, and when they moved you could hear a slight whir under the ice. I guess it came from a motor. My father couldn't copy that. I could tell from his face that he was defeated. In those days, everyone had lights. Not a single house was without them. That's one thing that has certainly changed. Today, only poor people have lights, and the poorest people of all have the most of them. At least this is true of the town I live in. There is one street that has the poorest people of all, and at Christmas it is ablaze with lights. There are electric deer on the lawns and huge inflatable Santas. The roofs have more Santas descending in sleighs with reindeer, that kind of thing. The rich people think it is ugly. They don't bother anymore, and they worry about the electric bill. They try to live calm, natural lives. They bake all their own bread. They make cookies and cakes and pies from scratch. They make their own beer and their own wine and liquors, and they grow their own food in the summer. And come winter, when they want a Christmas tree or some holly, they just walk out on their land and cut it. Poor people have to use money. They have to go to the store and buy food, especially the kind that is already made. It didn't used to be that way. When I was a kid, it was understood that poor people had to make everything themselves while rich people got to buy things. My mother bought whole cakes at the grocery store and said we were lucky not to have to make them ourselves. Now everything is reversed. If my mother and father were still alive, they would be very confused. I think we would all become confused eventually if we didn't die. Maybe death prevents a major confusion that would, if it were allowed to go on, eventually kill us all. When I was little, one Christmas ritual majorly confused me. My mother had a little ceramic sleigh that sat on the table. It was driven by a ceramic Santa and pulled by ceramic reindeer. Every year I had to wrap empty matchboxes so they looked like tiny presents. Then we piled them in the sleigh. They were the presents Santa was hauling, but they were empty, and it made me sad. My mother would sit at the table smoking, watching me wrap the matchboxes. "Can't we put anything in them?" I asked. "No," she said, "they're fake." "Couldn't we pretend?" I said. "That's what we're doing," she said. "I mean, real pretend," I said. But she just stared off into space, and I knew the conversation had ended. One thing is for certain. I wouldn't want to be a Christmas tree. It would be nice to be the center of attention, to be so decorated and lit that people stared at you in wonder and made a fuss over you and were mesmerized. That would be nice, but then you'd start dropping your needles, and people would become bored with you and say you weren't looking so good. And then they'd take off all your jewelry and haul you off to the curb where you would be picked up and crushed and eventually burned. That's the terrible part. Maybe that's why so many people today have fake trees. They are quite popular. Their limbs come apart and you can put them in boxes and store them. You can have one of these trees until you die, and you can pass it on to your children. They may not be real, but when you look at them, you can't tell the difference. That always makes people happy, not being able to tell the difference. And happiness, to want to be happy, is the most natural thing of all. The man in his big cradle was happy, though I never understood why, when he died, they didn't just saw the runners off and use it as his coffin. I don't think anyone would have noticed. In the end, the difference between a cradle and a coffin is hardly worth mentioning. Though then again, I wouldn't have seen the cradle later in the museum if that hadn't happened. I wouldn't have kept my red velveteen sleigh. I would have just thrown it away. No, never, when it comes to Christmas. When Christmas comes, I sit firmly on the lap of Charles Dickens and repeat after him, "Welcome everything." At this well-remembered time, when everything is capable, with the greatest of ease, of being changed into anything, on this day we shut out nothing. Sometimes I really love when you get a more like reflective free-form poem. It's almost like a micro-memoir. I feel like, I don't know, these reflective pieces always usually make me think a bit more about like my own views of Christmas and like the childhood traditions I grew up with. I hope you guys liked this more free form poem, and cue the outro. Thank you for joining me on another story or poetry adventure. Please do like this video. You can subscribe if you want to see more from me, and hit that notification bell so you know when I post, which is every Monday for flash fiction and every Thursday for poetry. If you have suggestions for poets or other short stories that I should read, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear your guys' suggestions. If you want to see what else I do around the internet, you can check out my Linktree. All my socials are there. If you like what I do here and you would like to support me monetarily, I do have a Patreon. My lowest tier is only $1.50 a month. And if you join for at least $5 a month, you get access to my Discord server. And I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you to everyone on my Patreon. Your support means so much to me, and I couldn't do this without you.